I was going in just expecting a pretty simple 2D platformer, and I ended up getting blown away by the art, the music, the story even, and just the quirkiness of the writing. It just felt like a really cohesive package that I wasn't expecting it to be.
This is why you should play The Messenger. Why, hello, and welcome to another episode of Why You Should Play. I am here with a brand new guest. I want to try to mix this podcast up, both in terms of the genre and style of game, but also my guest as well, because it's important to get a variety of perspectives to go along with the variety of genres that I want to cover. Today I have another new guest who is honestly one of the nicest young men I've had the pleasure of interacting with. He is a super fan of Super Mario Galaxy, which any rational human being should be because it's an amazing game. He dabbles in the JRPG and Japanese game space, which Sabotage Studio recently released an homage to the JRPG genre in Sea of Stars. But my buddy here is a fan of the Persona and Shin Megami Tensei, and really the Atlas games broadly. He's also a big fan of Yakuza as well. Many, many Japanese games that I would have never even known existed if not for him. So it is a joy to welcome my buddy Cameron, who we affectionately call Frog. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. And every time you do one of these intros, everyone has the same reaction. But actually getting my own, I definitely understand that because it's a lot and it's very appreciated. So thank you.
I try to balance it. I try not to get the guests flustered. I don't want to go overboard in my praise unless it's Sean Mason, in which case all positives are totally justified, I think. But it's part of me being appreciative as a host. People take time out of their schedules, especially on the weekends. I like to think that it's all for really passionately talking about games that we love. What are you currently playing? What's going on with you gaming wise currently?
I am currently playing Starfield, which is very different from The Messenger. It's the talk of the town, and I'm kind of impressed with how engaged I am with it. Because I've never really been a big Bethesda guy, but I just think the very NASA style sci-fi is really appealing to me, and all of the quests I've been doing has been really interesting, and even with the occasional Bethesda jank, it's just been an overall great experience. And then before that, I did Sea of Stars, which I would highly recommend. Then I played Super Mario Galaxy 2, which I would also very highly recommend. And all of those games are about stars, so I've just been playing a lot of star games.
And speaking of games that we love, The Messenger is one such game. What is your story with it?
Pretty much, this was maybe a year or so after I got back into the Xbox ecosystem. I was pretty much deeply into Nintendo and PlayStation for a long time. And because of that, I was also focusing primarily on physical games.
As you should.
Of course. And then, as you can do attest, getting a physical copy of The Messenger, little difficult at this point. But this was a game I had heard a lot about, but also knew nothing about at the same time. I think it was on sale on the Xbox store for around $6, around there. I bit the bullet because I was trying out a bunch of indie games that I hadn't really gotten to because of my fixation with physical games. And then I just heard a lot about The Messenger, but also not really knowing what kind of game, what kind of twists there are, and everything that it did. And then I ended up just getting really impressed by pretty much everything it did. I was going in just expecting a pretty simple 2D platformer, and I ended up getting blown away by the art, the music, the story even, and just the quirkiness of the writing. And it just felt like a really cohesive package that I wasn't expecting it to be. And also was one of the most fun to play 2D platformers I've played in a long time. Because that formula is pretty tried and true, but it took a lot for me to come away impressed, even more so with The Messenger, and just in terms of how it feels.
It's funny that you mentioned Xbox, because I'll go into this a little bit later, but Xbox was the last platform that it released on. So it's kind of funny how things work sometimes. And I have to ask, and I don't want to put you on the spot or embarrass you because I know you're of the younger generation than I am. Had you played many of those like retro style 2D side scrollers before The Messenger? How much of a kind of frame of reference did you have, if you don't mind me asking?
That is a fair question. I definitely grew up more with like the Mario style of 2D platformers, but because I was pretty entrenched in like everything about Nintendo, that also meant the virtual console. So I had played original Mario Bros, Mario Bros 3, Mario World, and then I have a friend who's like deeply into Mega Man. So I started to kind of dabble a little bit there. So I played Mega Man X, Mega Man Zero, and so I have a bit of a reference for these more classic games, but I never actually went back to like the Ninja Gaidens and stuff, which clearly inspired this game.
For sure, yeah, I totally get that. And I was even going to add the caveat. I was going to say what 2D side scrollers besides Mario, given kind of like an obvious, but it's really great when you play these kind of newer games that really open doors to show people what games used to be, how they were designed, how they looked, and as far as I'm concerned, that's a positive. When you play and enjoy the Messenger, you go on to play kind of games that inspired it. I think that's honestly, I think the developers of these games would love nothing more than for us to do that because it's in that spirit. They're pretty open about the inspiration, so it's really great to hear. We'll go into a little bit more detail about other games to play, but kind of speaking of background history, I wanted to because this is a really small indie studio, this Sabotage studio. I wanted to kind of go into the background and the history of them because I think it's I always find it fascinating, kind of the human story of how these small studios got to where they are, kind of ascended into prominence as Sabotage did, and we won't hold it against them, but they are from the far off moose land of Canada, I believe specifically Quebec, as the locals say. So they're very, very French Canadian. If you go on their website and see their staff, it's a lot of French sounding names, which I balk at trying to pronounce half of them. My many French speaking listeners will just probably recoil and make sounds of disgust if I try to pronounce them all. But I wanted to go into a little bit of history of Sabotage Studio. It starts with the president and creative director, basically the head honcho of Sabotage Studio. His name is Thierry Boulanger, and I know a certain Crash Bandicoot fan in Canada is probably cracking up laughing right now at my pronunciation of that, but I gave it my best effort like I do on this podcast or try to all the time. So the story of Sabotage and of the Messenger goes all the way back to 2007 when Thierry started working on a project called The Darkest Night way back in school. And so this game really did begin as a school project. He designed it and developed it himself. It was a 2D game, and he wasn't really sure what he wanted to make from there. He just kind of know, okay, I want it to be 2D and kind of a side scroller. So it's important, whether it's me starting this podcast or something much more involved like designing a game. You kind of need to know what you want to make from the outset. Otherwise, you make a game that's kind of one of these jack of all trades and master of none. So he knew he kind of wanted to draw from fantasy, kind of the fantasy world that he had been imagining earlier when he was younger. And this was 10 years before the Messenger release. So he started on this project called Darkest Night. And then in 2008, the next year, he got a job at a local game studio. And then a few years later, he met a man by the name of Philippe Zidzi, who was a veteran of two little titles called Prince of Persia, along with the first Assassin's Creed games. And I look at those titles very, very fondly. Looking back, that the Prince of Persia games are really, really fun. And the Assassin's Creed game was really mind blowing for its time. I'm not sure how well it holds up today, but back then it was amazing. So to have an opportunity to work with Philippe was really, really influential. So Philippe really helped Thierry work on this project, and he would eventually spend so much time that he would go on to work on the prototype for what would eventually be the Messenger. And so not only did it help the game itself, it helped Thierry be more well informed to gain experience and to say, hey, I think I can do this kind of game development thing. And one thing that I've always said to people is you should support the bros. I say it all the time, support the bros in whatever capacity that we can. I think this experience when I was going through this history of Sabotage and the Messenger, that really stood out to me a lot. Just give a little bit of your time and your energy and your knowledge to help other people and create a positive ripple effect. And so that was a really good, important lesson in that. So that was in 2012. And then when the Messenger really started to become a thing, they had a prototype in 2013, 2014. He pitched this project, the Messenger, to his current employers, and it got rejected. So this is another lesson in, hey, just because you get rejected, whether it's from a job application or maybe it's something a presentation within your current job or something you want to do, don't let it get you down. Don't take it personally. Keep going, keep plugging away, keep working, keep looking at opportunities, keeping an open mind to keep going. And so he was told specifically that this idea of the messenger was a terrible idea and that it was irrelevant and that it was proof that he would never be a designer and he should stick to coding. So he was really told to know his role and shut his mouth, which in hindsight, if he had just done that and kept his head down and been defeated, he would have never done that. And so kind of let it be a life lesson to all of you with the story of this game. When you're playing it, just don't listen to the haters. Keep going and believing in what you're doing and believing in yourself, and you'll get somewhere, even though it may not be exactly where you had planned. I think it will lead to something positive. And then in 2015, so this was a year after, and the prototype of the messenger was looking good enough to where they started entering it for contests for indie developers for funding, and in order to really submit it and win, they needed a name for their studio, for the development team. It's like, what do we call you? So they came up with the name Night Shroud, which I don't think it's as good as Sabotage Studio, but that's the name they gave it. So they began to start publicly talking about the messenger, Thierry and Philippe and some others. And so when things started getting serious with the messenger, they was like, you know what, we think we need to change the name. So they changed the name of the team from Night Shroud to Sabotage. And the studio is officially formed, which means it's incorporated as a business. So it's like, oh man, this thing is becoming more than just a passion project or a creative endeavor. It's becoming an actual thing, a business entity, a studio. So Sabotage Studio was formed in 2016, and they focused on really getting more funding, which an important thing about this funding was there was a funding program from the Canadian government. I forget the name of it. I don't have it in my notes, but it's basically just a big slush fund for the arts, and the projects would get submitted and they would either get approved or rejected. And this is another lesson in not giving up. The messenger was submitted 3 times and it was rejected the first 2 times. But the third time they got funding, which led to half of the entire game's development costs being funded by the Canadian government. So that's another cool thing. I kind of joked that the 2 best exports from Canada are Poutine and the messenger. And then, so with all this funding, it's really becomes what we call ramp up, right? So any kind of software development thing, when you need more components to work on the game, when things are signed off on and you're ready to move forward, you need more people. So 2017 was the really hiring ramp up. A lot of people started joining the team, artists, programmers, level designers, etc. So development got really hot and heavy. And then in 2018 is when the fireworks really started shooting off for the messenger. So in January of 2018, this game called The Messenger was officially revealed. And then in March, they announced a publishing deal with Devolver, who are I consider the premier sort of publishers in the indie space. And then not only was the developer publishing deal announced in March, but it was announced that it would launch on the Nintendo Switch. So it was revealed in March 2018, and then The Messenger was released on PC and Switch on August 18th, 2018. It was then released on PS4 on March 19th, 2019, and released on Xbox on June 25th, 2020. So it's still relatively recent. It's been out for a few years, but I think which makes the release of Sea of Stars all that more impressive here in 2023 to be kind of go from its latest release in 2020 to this whole release of a brand new game in a totally different genre with different art. It's a really remarkable story, and I just had to tell it. I don't know how many more of these sort of development history projects in depth of a studio that I'll go into, but after just 2 games, I think Sabotage has really established themselves as a premier indie developer because they've made 2 games in a row here that are extremely highly rated into really different genres, totally different styles of games. And I cannot wait to get to Sea of Stars. I think I'm not sure if I bought it digitally already, but I pre-ordered a physical copy because we support physical games here on this podcast. I think I've mentioned it over and over again, and I will stand by that to my last breath or until the last physical video game is sold, whichever comes first. And so, having said all that, another question is, why did I choose The Messenger, aside from the obvious of how great the story is? Well, something really annoyed me about the reception to Sea of Stars, and one of this was, I'm not going to mention names, but there was a really what I call nitpicking of one of the aspects of the game being what they call comma splices, which means you separate thoughts with commas instead of periods. And that is often with English outside of American English. It could be a localization thing. Either way, I don't think it's that big of an issue. It wasn't a big issue. Apparently, it's in the messenger. I didn't even notice it. I didn't even think to look for it because you know what? I don't care because it's not a big deal. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to do the messenger now on this podcast, out of celebration, out of Sea of Stars releasing, out of support for Sabotage. And I think people who get caught up in such a silly thing about within the grand scheme of an amazing game need to get over themselves. And that's all I have to say about that. Was there anything that stuck out to you about what I went through, about Sabotage, about the game itself? Anything while I get a drink here?
No worries. First of all, you did a great job with that development history. Like that
Thank you.
was a nice flow of everything.
Thank you.
Uh, I have a few thoughts about that. First of all, Thierry's first boss or former boss was incredibly off the mark in terms of this kind of game not being relevant. It just, especially with the success of the Messenger and other indie platformers, it seemed very short-sighted, and I'm glad that he didn't take his boss's advice and just sit down and continue coding, because he clearly is a good coder. But I'm glad that he was able to express his passions and do what he wanted to do. Also, another thing about the development history that wasn't fully mentioned was he has a good pipeline also in terms of keeping his staff supported. So what he does is he plans the DLC in advance, not actually working on it, but by having plans for DLCs for each game, he doesn't have to cut off any staff in the ramp up for the next project. So there's a DLC for the Messenger called Picnic Panic, and that was worked on during the pre-production phase of Sea of Stars. So a small team was able to work on the DLC, while the other team was able to do the pre-production for Sea of Stars, and it just meant that all of the staff were able to work on something, so there didn't have to be any hiring freezes or layoffs during that period. So I just wanted to respect that as well, just because in this industry where so many people get fired for lack of jobs, pretty much, or the production of a game just doesn't work out for them, I'm glad that Sabotage is so focused on just maintaining talent and doing what's best for its workers.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Positive, effective people management is a very rare thing. I can attest to that in my many years of various corporate lives. That's a really great point that you raised, and speaks to even more to how good of a studio they are. And so these two games, The Messenger and Sea of Stars. So specifically with The Messenger, I wanted to go into the premise and inspirations. And I think kind of the obvious one from the outset is Ninja Gaiden. So very much on an aesthetic level with the ninja and the types of attacks in the world. Yeah, they were pretty transparent with um, the inspiration of Ninja Gaiden, so much so that I think I forget what publication it was or what outlet, maybe IGN. They actually sat a couple of the main developers of the original Ninja Gaiden down, and they were really pleased and impressed that it was not only inspired by Ninja Gaiden, but it really had a remix of it and was different from it. It stood out on its own, which I think any kind of homage should. It's otherwise you're just trying to recreate something. It's not necessarily original. It's not evolving or different. It's not its own. So, was there anything about the kind of the premise or the inspirations that you wanted to speak to as well?
I think it being so inspired by Ninja Gaiden is important because I think one, just being upfront about your inspirations is a really cool thing in the industry. Just
Mm-hmm.
because if you know what you're getting into, then it'll attract more fans of that kind of game. But also, if you're clearly inspired by something, it shows how much passion you have for that, and there's an inherent sense that you want to do right by the games that you're inspired by. And then another thing going into what Sabotage does so well is that they take these games that, like Ninja Gaiden, that are known for being brutally challenging, and then they modernize it in an interesting way where the Messenger still has a good amount of challenge, but it's less of that NES challenge where off-screen enemies will just hit you or anything like that. And that kind of goes into Sabotage as a studio's motto, where they just want to take the games that you played as a kid and then create games that make you feel like that again, which I think the Messenger encapsulates perfectly.
For sure. Yeah, I totally agree on, especially on a number of points that you just raised there, which is a perfect segue, kind of getting into the game itself. So, the premise of the game, and again, right, you don't have to worry about spoilers. So, but we will kind of set up the premise is that, as I'm sure many of you can see from the box art, is you play as a ninja who takes up the mantle of the messenger, which means he has to take a scroll. I believe it's to a mountain, And again, we're getting kind of into the meta commentary again. It is a side scroller where you are literally carrying a scroll. We're not being subtle here. And so, yeah, I honestly, I don't want to go into any more detail than that, other than to say there is a sort of switching between 8 and 16-bit worlds. I'm not going to say anything more than that. That is in the game. I'm not going to say why or provide any context, but it is remarkable the way that it is done, and it'll make sense when you continue to play the game. So, in terms of gameplay, it is a side scroller. You move about the world. I think that I would describe the game as primarily traversal focused. I think that is, for the most part, that is the primary challenge in the game, which I love. Like you said, Ninja Gaiden can be punishingly brutally difficult, mostly based around the combat and the messenger. I think Ninja Gaiden, it feels more claustrophobic than the messenger does, just due to the way that you traverse in the messenger, which I'll mention now is primarily jumping. And the biggest conceit of this game, with the kind of primary crux of the game, is that when you attack something with your sword, it generates a new jump. So you can jump, you can hit you can hit strategically placed lampposts or enemies, and so you can almost just kind of pogo stick throughout the game. And then there's also throwing items. I believe they are called shuriken in the game. And then there is I'm not sure if this is I think the dash does an attack as well. So, and then there also is a grapple. And if there's anything else, I'll kind of kick it off to you now, wherever you want to take it with kind of the gameplay and the overall experience of moment to moment gameplay in the game.
I think the way you phrased it, with it being more of a momentum focused game, is a major reason of why it connects with me so much, because I like challenging 2D platformers, but I also
Mm-hmm.
like having a sense that I have full control over my movement. And the Messenger just has a perfect flow where, especially when you get the grappling hook, which is probably my favorite grappling hook in anything, it just creates a perfect sense of flow, and you can grab onto an enemy and then bounce off of that enemy and then grapple onto another enemy in order to just keep going. And the enemies exist, and they some of them do provide a challenge, but it's mostly there to help with the traversal, almost, where it's less about how will I defeat this enemy and more is how can I use this enemy. And I think just that just creates a really interesting gameplay system. I also won't talk about the spoilers behind the switching between the 8-bit and the 16-bit, but I think it just does a great job at making each level more interesting as well, because it gives you a sense that there's more than meets the eye when you go through it in the 8-bit world. And then, especially with the way the music changes and becomes more full to represent the changing of the hardware almost,
Yeah.
it just creates a really engaging experience. And that music is super good too. So
Yeah, it is. It is very good, and I think that looking back, what a lot of developers have said about those older games is one of the biggest development challenges was trying to fit everything on the game, including the audio, because the audio would take up so much file size. And so that's part of the glow up when you go from the 8-bit to the 16-bit is like, oh, the music is so much more involved, kind of to go along with the more involved detailed graphics. And your sprite changes as well. The 8-bit is what you see in the art there, the kind of purple ninja, but the 16-bit is the more involved. He has the hat, and he has a little bit more intricately designed costume, and I think the sprite has more motion behind it when it's idle. And yeah, it's just extremely well done. It's a testament to the art team with instantly shifting between the two, making them look like they exist sort of as companion worlds, is what I'll say. And I'm not going to speak any more to it. There was a word I was going to utter that would kind of give it away. Yeah, it really is remarkable how the world does change and there is a consistency. I think everything kind of feels like it fits together into this larger world. And you mentioned the overworld enemies, and I think the overworld enemies themselves aren't really challenging at all for the most part. I think they mostly just stand there. Some of them move around. A vast majority of them are one hit, so it's like you hit the enemy and it dies, and you can jump again, for example. And there's a few that are more tanky. I think there's one that it takes like 2 or 3 hits to get through to defeat. But these enemies, you pick up currency. I forget the exact name of the currency. Maybe it's gold or something, but you use them on a vendor, and you pick up the currency, and you can go to this vendor throughout various stages of the level to buy upgrades, which again, when you hear upgrades, it's not very robust at all. It's pretty straightforward and simple. We're not talking about multiple skill trees or you have to min max or anything even close to that. It's genuine upgrades for your character, but nothing that's going to feel overwhelming for what you would expect going into a kind of a 2D side scrolling action game. And I echo your sentiment as well with how the traversal makes you feel more empowered. I think that's more of my personal preference when we talk about those 2D side scrollers, whether it's like a traditional level to level focus or it's more of a Metroidvania, which we'll go into that later on. But I think for my personal preference, I prefer something more like an Ori, for example, than necessarily like a Hollow Knight. So there is a sense of second to second empowerment with moving around the level in Ori, or in this game in the Messenger, it's bouncing around off of lampposts and enemies and other barriers, grappling to walls or grappling to the lamps that are posted up or any kind of object. So, was there anything else that you wanted to elaborate on for the gameplay itself?
I think that the vendor is the shopkeep is just probably one of my favorite aspects of the game too. Not just because of the simple upgrade system, which I think is greatly appreciated in a game like this, where you really want to be bogged down by menus or not really understanding what does what. When you're at a store, it's really straightforward in terms of how you make the experience better for yourself. I also don't want to spoil too much about the vendor, but just make sure you keep talking to him. It may seem like he doesn't want to talk, but just keep talking to him. Don't worry.
He's very lonely in there. He, for like I said, you come upon these vendor rooms, and it's kind of in this weird, I don't know how to explain it, sort of this ethereal black space. Kind of, it feels like you're in the middle of outer space. But yeah, he's just kind of there chilling, and we'll go more into a little bit of that. But yeah, it's more reinforcing the lighthearted tone of the game, and it's genuinely funny, the tone of the game. And speaking of humor, is kind of the bosses that you'll come across in the game as well. I think that is by far the standout of the combat in this game is the boss fights. So you'll go through these overworld enemies, you'll mostly just breeze through them. They're really, really easy. They're basically there to just collect currency for upgrades and such. But um, the boss battles are genuinely challenging, but I think, and this speaks to the design of the game as well, they never felt unfair. I would describe the challenge of this game as just really, really perfect. And I think the perfect challenge of the game, it's not, I would not describe it as easy, but I wouldn't describe it as like capital H hard either. I would say it's challenging. And the boss fights are just proof of that. They are really, really good. They're very inventive. Some of the designs and the way the bosses interact and move is really, really funny. And I think it really is what puts it over the top as an exceptional game, because you go through all these levels with really just incredible kind of power fantasy traversal, and then you get to these genuinely challenging boss fights. So this game challenges you in movement and in combat, and in the boss fights it's oftentimes both. So you'll have to do some really fancy traversal to evade the boss's attacks, as well as go in there and you can throw your shuriken or hit him or grapple to him or what have you. And so, and I don't want to spoil any of the boss fights, but did the boss fights stuck out to you as well?
Definitely. I agree with the hard but not so challenging aspect of the bosses, where I definitely died a few times, but I also didn't feel like I was going to be stuck on them for a very long time. And they're also just really well designed and telegraph their attacks really well and clearly, so it never feels like the game pulls something that you just couldn't really predict. It's just a matter of mastering the encounter. And going into the comedy aspect of the bosses, I'm not going to spoil one of the bosses, but one of them has a really fun entrance where they appear really tall and menacing, but just kind of once they land on the ground, you realize they're not actually as tall as they presented them to be, and it just really exceptional stuff from the art team in terms of being able to portray these different bosses of all shapes and sizes. And I'm looking at the list of them now, and it's just so impressive how well drawn and animated they all are.
There's one boss, I think it's kind of at the end of the first act of the game is what I will call it, that is just an amazing design. It's probably the most iconic boss design in the game, which is an amazing design. There's another boss that's hilarious. I don't want to spoil it, but it kind of involves like some nudity is what I'll say, but it's done in just a hilarious way. And the final boss is just an amazingly cool design. And yeah, I think it's just perfect. Honestly, what I was going to say is that if anything, and I just remember to mention this as well, is honestly the bigger challenge is going to be some of the traversal challenges, and specifically there are these challenge rooms throughout the game. They're totally optional. They're literally side rooms um, where you collect. I forget the name of the currency. Maybe you have it up, but there's these special collectibles that you collect. There's 40 of them total in the game. I collected, I think, 23 of them. I didn't want to go through all of them. I was like, you know what, I think I did enough of them. I didn't want to really go through and explore for more and get more of them. But if you do want more of a traversal challenge, even more than what the main game offers you, those are there as well. Did you do some of them?
I definitely agree about the challenge being primarily traversal focused, and when the traversal is as meaningful and fun as it is in the messenger, it's a challenge that I'm willing to take on. And I did some of the optional things, and I believe this is the currency we were thinking about was the power seals.
Yes, power seals. Yeah, they're like giant green coins.
Yeah, I've definitely done some of them, but they remind me a lot of like the B sides of Celeste. If anyone has played that, where it's just very focused traversal challenges where there's one true solution, and it's just a matter of executing that. And I think they're all really fun, but there's also just a pretty good amount of them, so I never really felt I never felt the need where I had to do all of them, but I felt rewarded every time I did do them at the same time.
It really is rewarding, even if you don't plan to get all of them. It's like, okay, I want a little bit of a challenge. So they are there throughout the various levels. I'll go into it more, a little bit more in the caveats, but the grapple is just so addicting. It's like a little dopamine hit whenever you know that you hit an enemy or you grapple to something and it generates a new jump for you. So even if you die, just kind of getting back to where you were before is still super enjoyable. And because you can do that sort of, it really is almost like a rhythm game. Similar again to Celeste, where you're kind of like really bouncing around the various levels and maps. And so, speaking of dying, there is when you do die, you basically have to pay the toll. There is this, God, I don't even know what he is. He's a,
He's a little bit of an imp in a way.
yes, an imp. Yeah, I think an imp is the proper term. And you basically have to pay him a toll every time, and he revives you. And so he'll revive you, and you have to pay a toll, and then he'll go away again. There eventually is an upgrade to reduce the fee by 50%. Basically takes you back to a checkpoint. And I think the checkpoints throughout the game are pretty generous. I think they're fair. There's no auto saving. You do have to hit a checkpoint in order to save, but they are there all across each level and map. And
I never felt like the punishment for death was too bad. It sounds like a lot, like having to pay a toll, but in a way, Quarble is the name of the kind of imp guy, and a lot of his characterization is very. He's kind of incompetent, and that kind of emphasizes the humor of the situation. So even though he's taking this toll from you for dying, you also just get a little bit of enjoyment for him just existing and being who he is. And like you said, you can get an upgrade for reducing the amount of money you have to spend to revive. But even then, if you're just playing regularly and not focusing on the power seals, I don't think it'll be too much of a punishment. And I never found it too much of a deterrent from dying.
no, yeah, and there's so many enemies in the overworld that you can collect. You can collect currency pretty rapidly to kind of break you free of Quarrel and start earning even more money back. But it's funny that you kind of mentioned his characterization too, because it kind of plays into the humors that when you die, he'll appear temporarily in the loading screen with some kind of funny message. He is kind of very single minded in having his role of like, oh, I revive you and you pay me money. And he just kind of enjoys messing with you and giving snide comments. But it is charming. It's very kind of cheeky, I would say. It's very, very funny. It's why I didn't mind dying too much, because I was waiting to see what the funny message would be to kind of crack me up and add some levity, because there are a couple of moments in the game that are genuinely challenging, especially the traversal where you're like, man, I gotta time this grapple or this jump, and you'll have to try it maybe a handful of times, but it does kind of add a bit of levity that if you really get frustrated, you'll kind of chuckle and shake it off. You would agree with that?
Oh, definitely. The game has moments where it does want to take itself more seriously, but overall, it's just a very fun and lighthearted experience. And the death system, in a way, also emphasizes that, like you said. And even if it is challenging, as long as you're having fun, it doesn't feel too much like a challenge either, where you never feel like, oh, I have to redo this. I don't want to do this, but you're always just having a good time with it. So you never really get hung up on that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that what helps out a lot too is the developers clearly took kind of level design and the game design and the boss encounter design very, very seriously, so that they really can kind of get away with having that sort of cheeky, oftentimes lighthearted tone. And the writing itself is very, very funny, so they can get away with it too. So it really all works so well together, remarkably well. And like you'd mentioned, there are serious moments in the game, specifically the end, that genuinely surprised me and were pretty touching. Was there anything else, from your notes or maybe things that you recollected about kind of the gameplay or moment to moment experience of the game that you wanted to speak to or bring up?
I think we covered all that I wanted to talk about regarding the gameplay, because the rest of the stuff would relate to like the presentation, but I feel like everything about the gameplay was summarized pretty well by us.
What I can move into now is the caveats, and give my usual spiel. The podcast isn't meant to be negative, so the caveats are going to be kind of like qualifiers, things that you should expect going into the game that maybe we haven't spoken to in like a super effusive way. And so when you said presentation, what were you referring to specifically?
I was mostly talking about the extreme level of detail in the pixel arts, especially in the backgrounds and the music. Just those two combined really enhance the experience in a way that not a lot of other games can compare to, where it feels like every single screen is a painting in a way, and the music always does a great job at keeping you energized and keeping you motivated to keep trying again. So I just really wanted to commend them for how well they executed on those aspects of the game.
It speaks to the meticulous design of the game, is that they knew people would die. I don't want to say fairly often, but they would die a number of times, and to where it wasn't too discouraging. They kind of set you up to get you right back in the game to make it feel encouraging and welcoming. And the musical tracks complement the world so well. There's one that I think I'll probably use in this podcast that is a sort of what I will call a sky level. You're in the sky. I don't want to spoil anything more than that, but the track is amazing. It's really energetic. It really makes you feel like you're really up there in the sky and bouncing around and dashing around and stuff. So, was there anything else that kind of stood out to you?
Just one song in particular stands out to me a lot, which is the song that plays when you're talking to the shopkeeper. It
Oh
just
yeah, it's like down, down, down,
dun,
down,
dun,
down.
dun, dun, dun.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's very quirky. It fits that part of the game. Again, like I mentioned, it's the music complements the specific areas so
definitely,
well.
definitely. And when you're spending the time in the shop, like buying upgrades or spending the time to talk to the shopkeeper, that song just really makes that whole experience more enjoyable to me, just because you're always energized at the same time.
It's funny, you will spend more time in that shopkeeper room with things that are not the upgrade tree. I don't really want to go into too much detail because it's a little bit spoilery. I wanted to kind of you discover it for yourself. Yeah. So one of the caveats that I have is this is not a negative. It's you should use the D-pad to traverse the world. Do not use the analog sticks. Again, it is a 2D game, and I feel like I tried the analog sticks for like I don't know 10 seconds. And I'm like I can't do this. The D-pad is just perfect for this game. Would you agree? Is that how you play the game?
Absolutely. Pretty much any time I play a 2D platformer, unless it's something that's enhanced by using a thumbstick, like the Rayman Legends or like Rayman Origins. So there are some 2D platformers where the move sets get enhanced by using a regular thumbstick, but every time I play a 2D game, it has to be with a D-pad. So I definitely agree there. It just the level of precision is unmatched, and you definitely want to be able to pull off these precise jumps, especially.
I always find it these kind of smaller, fascinating conversations where it's like, what controls did you use, to play this game? The next caveat I had, we've mentioned it a little bit, is don't forget to grapple. There's so many times when I died in this game, and I'm like, oh wait, I could have grappled that wall, or I could have grappled that enemy, or you can even grapple like spikes that fall from ceilings. When in doubt, you can probably grapple something near you. That was probably my biggest, most consistent hang up with the game. And like Cameron mentioned, you can grapple enemies too, so it's just incredibly rewarding. Anything else, kind of about the grappling that you wanted to mention?
I think utilizing the grappling is definitely a good caveat, but I think once you execute some fun maneuvers with the grappling hook, it will become much less of a caveat in general because you'll just want to keep doing it all the time.
Another caveat that I have that I mentioned earlier is that the basic level enemies are super easy. So if you're going through the game and you're like, especially in the very beginning, you're like, this game is like really, really easy. What's going on? That's not really the focus of the game. The traversal becomes more and more involved and the most rewarding part of the game. And when you win the combat, you'll get those boss battles, which again, we won't spoil. They're just really, really memorable. The next one is probably the most caveat of caveats, is that there is a shift in the overall structure of this game. I want to say about, what would you say, Cameron, about a third of the way through?
There's definitely a shift early on, but I think you notice how important that shift is in terms of like what you're doing for your objectives later in the game.
Yeah, for sure. So the game, about a third of the way through, it becomes I shudder to even call it a Metroidvania because it's not nearly as intricate and complex as like a real Metroidvania, but I would say it becomes like a Metroidvania light. So you'll go through kind of a lot of these levels in a linear fashion, and then again, I don't want to spoil it. You'll kind of hit a hub area, is what I will call it, to where you'll go back through these other levels and have to do certain things to be able to progress through the game. And it's not overly involved, but I think it really does, and it enhances the traversal even more. It makes the traversal capabilities really shine and sing. And I was a little bit put off by it at first. I think I even mentioned that to you as well. And the shifting from the 8-bit to 16-bit, I'm just not generally not a huge fan of these sort of realm shift mechanics in video games. But I think in this game, honestly, I think it does it the best out of, say, these three games that I mentioned. And it does it in a way that I found the most rewarding, for sure, and for reasons that I won't go into. And part of this Metroidvania is you'll have to find certain locations to get things. I'm sorry, I'm trying to speak very obliquely and vaguely, but sort of another caveat with this is that you can buy hints of where to go from the vendor as well, so it is very accessible. He may not point exactly to where the object is, but he will point you to where you need to go, and you still need to traverse through the area to get the object that you need to get.
Yeah, it's really difficult to talk about the intricacies of this section just because of how spoiler related it is, but I definitely agree there. Buying the hints was a must for me. I think this section would have benefited overall by having a more traditional Metroidvania map as like an option, because it's really clever how the levels are linked with each other. But being able to tangibly see how they look on the map, it would help emphasize where specifically you need to go for certain things much more clearly. So if there was ever a time I was stuck in this game, it was related to trying to find something I needed to find in the late game.
Yeah, and it's very thematic, is what I'll say. There is more going on, and I literally have in the kind of the second caveat of the Metroidvania thing is that the map is just fine. Like it's very, it exists. It is, I would say, it is passable. That is an aspect of where it's like, oh, this is their first game, and I think it functions just well enough overall. But it's certainly not the ideal Metroidvania situation, even though I really, really enjoyed and admired what they were going for thematically, is what I will say. And so the last two caveats that I have are, as far as the story, I will say that the story is pretty heavy at the very beginning and at the very end. You do kind of get some crumbs along the way with some little tasks that you'll perform or characters that you'll interact with. But the story is very, very lore heavy at the very beginning, at the very end. The ending of this game I found actually very, very touching, is what I will say. Would you agree?
Absolutely. With how fun the game has with itself, really don't expect the ending to be as emotionally resonant as it was. It's a pretty tragic series of events, and the whole situation around the ending is just has had definitely had me thinking a bit. And it was just not something I expected from this game, but it also shows the range of storytelling possible from Sabotage. And you'll be very engaged even if there are comma splices. Turns out if you're having fun and engaged, the comma splices don't actually matter.
Yeah, no, imagine hyper focusing that much. What a miserable experience. But no, you get such a dump at the end in terms of the story and what was going on. And again, for you think like, oh, it's just this retro 2D game. You're just gonna like bounce around and grapple things and have fun and be a ninja. And you're like, oh, they're actually telling a pretty human story here, and the world they built is super super cool. I was like, all right, they cooked, as the kids say nowadays. I was not familiar with their game.
Yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence that Sea of Stars is very entrenched with the Messenger as well, because the world they did create was just has so much room for potential and exploration.
For sure. Yeah, I totally agree. And my last caveat that I have is go through and experience everything that the shopkeeper themselves has to offer. That was what I will say.
Uh, Entirely agree. I spent a long time just talking to the shopkeeper, and I managed to be interested by everything they had to say. Even in the sometimes they're more jokes, sometimes they actually have a little bit of wisdom to share. But the shopkeeper should definitely not be slept on. They're a pretty important character, and I think you'll just get more out of the game if you take the time to just have a friendly little chat.
Yeah, and there is payoff with the shopkeeper as well. The last sort of formal section that I have is I wanted to introduce a new segment in this podcast because it's obviously called Why You Should Play. And so the idea that I wanted to introduce this section where if you liked this game, if you play and like it, then what else should you play? And I think the number one is obviously Ninja Gaiden. And what I will say with the qualifier with that is that Ninja Gaiden is extremely punishing. It is much more combat focused, and it can be smothering and intimidating with how unforgiving it is. The jumping and the platforming is extremely precise. The enemies are unforgiving, and it may not be something that you drive with or much less beat one of the games, but I think it's important, like I discussed on the esteemed Backlog Brain Rot show, when we're going back and playing the 2D Mario games, you really should go back and play some of these older games, kind of the Father Abrahams, if you will, the Ninja Gaidens, Super Mario Brothers, etc. I have one other game, but I'll kick it over to you for some of your recommendations.
My main recommendation is something I'm sure many people have already played, but if you want a retro game that clearly takes the retro formula and modernizes it in a very engaging way, it would be Shovel Knight. Definitely different types of platformers where Shovel Knight, I would say Shovel Knight has more of a combat focus, even if it is very platform heavy, like the Messenger, though I would compare it more to like a Mega Man or a DuckTales than Ninja Gaiden or what the Messenger does with that kind of formula. But something that takes that kind of game, makes it easily accessible for a modern audience, I think is worth it. And then I mentioned it earlier, but Celeste, in terms of the level of tight platforming and especially the B sides of that game, which are the optional areas. So if you really like the challenge rooms of the Messenger, I think you would really like those as well.
Yeah, I would agree. And there's no actual combat in Celeste, is there? It's like pretty much all traversal that I recall.
Yeah, it's entirely traversal based,
Yeah, it is
which
entirely traversal, and that's another game that has really good effective themes between gameplay and story and what it explores. The other game is more in the Ninja Gaiden vein. I know I've seen people compare it to The Messenger, which I think is kind of unfair to both games. But the final game that I would recommend is Cyber Shadow, and I say that with it is very, very much more combat focused and much more in the vein of Ninja Gaiden, and it is very, very hard. I died. I don't even want to say how many times I died in that game. It is super, super challenging if you want more of that combat focused in a traditional 2D side scroller. But it is another one where the music is awesome, the art is exquisite, and the world is super, super, super cool. You're a cyber ninja. I mean, like what? Like that's just cool. So those are our recommendations. I'm sure maybe many of you in this audience who listen have already played those games as well. And Shovel Knight has a huge variety. There's a lot of expansions, right? Like different characters who play different styles. And even if you play like the main Shovel Knight game, there's so much more to that game than just the base game. Correct?
definitely there's a lot of just based on how Shovel Knight was kickstarted and a lot of the stretch goals. There was a lot of expansions for Shovel Knight, and they all have different characters who play differently, and you get different story moments that you wouldn't get if you just played the main game. So I think it's definitely worth delving into it if you like what you play of Shovel Knight.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we did a pretty good job of discussing this game, The Messenger, spoiler free. I mean, like I said, it's there on pretty much any platform. I'm sure you can play it even on Steam Deck as well. It's at home pretty much wherever you want to play it on a TV or handhelds. It should be pretty inexpensive nowadays. I mean, even if it's like full price for whatever reason, it's totally worth it. I would pay, honestly, I think I would pay $40 for this game in a heartbeat. And it is, without a doubt, one of my most enjoyable gaming experiences of the past few years.
I entirely agree. And if you want more Messenger, the DLC is also very cheap. And if you want more of a intense challenge, I would say, but also in a very fun setting, the DLC is definitely worth it if you want, because it's I got it for only a few dollars, and that was more than worth it. And it's more Messenger, and it's definitely more of a challenging Messenger as well.
Yeah, that sounds good. I didn't even know there was DLC for it until I kind of looked up the game and went to buy it on this. I think it was on the PlayStation Store, and I'm like, oh, there's DLC. I didn't even know. But yeah, I mean, honestly, whatever the price is, even if at full price, it's totally worth it. I would happily pay full price for this game. Like we mentioned, I kind of wish there would be a physical reprint. That would be amazing because physical copies are at least $150.
It's definitely worth $150, but I don't know if it's economically feasible to spend $150 on the Messenger at the same time.
I mean, I've been known to spend money and engage in commerce for physical games, but I think that's a little bit too rich even for my blood. Yeah, I can't think of anything else. Cameron, it was a joy to talk to you about this game. Sea of Stars is out. It released, I think, about a month ago. I want to
Yeah,
say
August
thereabouts.
29th, I believe.
Yeah, just under a month ago. I think that one is $35. I mean, that's a total steal. I played the demo. Like I said, I cannot wait to get to it. It's more of a JRPG, but it still has that kind of that same really Sabotage Studio charm. And yes, Cameron, thank you again so much. We will definitely look to have you back on a future episode. You play a wide variety of games. Your interpretation of fun is pretty varied, as I like to think mine is. And as I do with every guest, you'll have to send me kind of a list of games that you would want to evangelize for it. Thank you very much. And any final thoughts?
First of all, just thank you for having me. I was really great. It was a really great time recording with you, and I had a really great time just talking. And if there ever is a game that we can talk about again, I would love to join. I guess if there's any major takeaway about the Messenger overall, it's that after I played the Messenger, anything that Sabotage makes is a day one for me, and they just have not missed with the Messenger and Sea of Stars, and they're a studio that's absolutely worth paying full price for and being there to support, because they're the perfect example of what great games can be. And I just want everyone to be able to support them doing what they do.
For sure. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. Support the bros, support the devs that make art, and we will see you next time.